All right, get ready because we are diving deep into the Gospel of Mark. It's known for its fast-paced style, and we've got a lot to uncover.
It's interesting how Mark, compared to the other Gospels, just throws you right into the action. He really emphasizes what Jesus does instead of long teachings. It's like watching an ancient action movie.
I like that. An ancient action movie. And speaking of action, Mark starts right off by introducing this unforgettable character, John the Baptist. The guy's out in the wilderness wearing camel hair and eating locusts and wild honey.
Can you picture that scene? It's like straight from the Old Testament. It reminds me of prophets like Elijah. Mark really sets this tone that something big is about to happen. Someone who is going to change things is about to enter the scene.
And that someone, of course, is Jesus. The story of his baptism is really something else. The heavens open, the Spirit comes down like a dove, and God himself says, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased."
It's a major moment, not just some ritual. It's like God is publicly announcing who Jesus is. It's a confirmation of his purpose. It's the start of his ministry.
And Mark follows that powerful event with the temptation of Jesus. It's like he wants to highlight this battle between good and evil that's going to continue throughout Jesus' work.
Right. From the very beginning, Mark wants us to know that although Jesus is the Son of God, he's also going to face opposition, challenges, and temptations. And how strong he is in resisting those temptations says a lot about him.
And talking about strength, Mark quickly shows us Jesus' authority over evil spirits. We see these accounts of exorcisms, like there's one where a man with an unclean spirit recognizes Jesus as the Holy One of God. Even the demons know who he really is.
It's fascinating that Mark is using what people believed back then. They thought unclean spirits were like evil and oppression. Jesus' power over them shows not only his authority, but also his compassion for people who are suffering.
And this compassion isn't just about casting out demons. Mark really emphasizes how much of a healer Jesus is. He's always surrounded by people who need help, and he heals them in amazing ways. Like, remember the story about Simon's mother-in-law? Jesus just takes her hand, and she's healed instantly.
That's such a powerful image. It shows Jesus' authority and his compassion working together. He doesn't need any fancy rituals. Just a touch is enough to bring about healing.
But healing also leads to conflict. Right? Like when Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, the Pharisees are furious. They think he's broken the law.
The Sabbath was a huge deal in Jewish tradition. It was a day for God, a day of rest. There were very strict rules. So Jesus healing on the Sabbath, it challenged their authority and how they understood God.
It's like he's saying compassion and healing shouldn't be trapped by rules.
Yeah.
Sometimes doing the right thing means we have to question things.
Yes. And this idea of challenging traditions is all over Mark's gospel. Jesus is always confronting the religious leaders. He pushes them to go beyond just the rules and see God's true love and mercy.
And then we have the parables. They are such a unique and powerful way to teach. Mark doesn't use as many parables as other gospels, but the ones he does use are very vivid. Take the parable of the sower, for example.
Yeah.
So simple but so deep.
The parable of the sower is all about how open we are to the message of God's kingdom. It's not enough to just hear it. It has to take root and grow. It's about what kind of soil we are. It's about how well that message is received.
It makes you think. It makes you ask yourself, what kind of soil am I? Am I really listening to God's word, or is there something blocking it?
And this question would have been really important to Mark's first readers. They were early Christians, maybe even facing persecution for what they believed. They needed to be rooted in the gospel to survive.
And speaking of surviving, Mark's gospel is full of dramatic stories, like Jesus calming the storm and walking on water. It's like he's showing Jesus as this powerful figure who can control nature.
But it's more than just showing off his power. Those miracles have deeper meanings. If Jesus can calm a real storm just by speaking, think about what he can do for the storms in our lives.
That's a good point. Our anxieties, our doubts. Those are the storms Jesus wants to calm for us.
Exactly. Mark is telling us that no matter how chaotic life gets, there's a power greater than us that can bring peace.
But not everyone was happy with this display of power, right? We start to see more and more people opposing Jesus, especially the Pharisees and experts in the law. They seem to feel threatened by him.
That's a big part of Mark's gospel. It's not just about miracles and teachings. It's about two different ways of seeing the world. The religious leaders, with their strict rules, represent a system that Jesus is trying to change.
You can really feel the tension as the story goes on. And it's not just the religious leaders. Even the disciples don't fully understand Jesus.
What's amazing about how Mark shows the disciples is that they're human. They're not perfect followers. They ask questions. They misunderstand things. They even argue. we can relate to them.
Totally. Like when Jesus tells them for the third time that he's going to suffer and die, and they're still arguing about who's the greatest. It's almost funny how they don't get it.
Think about it, though. The idea of a Messiah who suffers was completely new to them. They thought the Messiah would be a powerful leader, someone who would defeat Rome and create an earthly kingdom.
So Jesus was changing their whole idea of the Messiah.
Exactly. He was challenging them, and us too, to rethink what real power and leadership are. It's not about being in charge or being successful in the world. It's about humility, serving others, and sacrificing for something bigger than yourself.
That's a really powerful message, especially in a world that often values the opposite. But Mark doesn't just talk about ideas. He shows us what this different kind of kingdom looks like.
Right. Like the story of Jesus calling Levi, the tax collector, to follow him. This shocked the Pharisees. Tax collectors were seen as traitors.
So Jesus was reaching out to someone who is considered a sinner.
Exactly. This shows how radical and welcoming Jesus' ministry was. He's not limited by social rules or religious groups. He's looking for the people who are pushed aside.
That's challenging, but also hopeful. It means God's grace and love are for everyone.
And that's the core theme in Mark's gospel. Whether it's the woman begging for her daughter to be healed, or the Roman soldier whose faith amazes Jesus, we see how much God cares. We see his willingness to reach beyond boundaries.
It's like Mark is saying, don't underestimate faith, no matter where it comes from.
Exactly. As we continue exploring Mark, we'll see this tension between Jesus' power and his call to follow him play out in even bigger ways.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to see what happens next. I think we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive into Mark. We've seen John the Baptist prepare the way. We saw Jesus' baptism and temptation. We've talked about his authority over evil spirits and his healing power, and even the mystery of why he told people to keep quiet.
And we've only just begun. Mark's gospel is full of surprises. It's full of challenges and triumphs, and it gives us deep insights into faith, following Jesus, and God's kingdom. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive. We'll keep exploring this incredible book.
So last time, we were talking about the messianic secret, this idea that Jesus often told people to keep quiet about his miracles. It's kind of strange, right? If we wanted to share the good news, why all the secrecy?
Yeah, it seems a little backwards, but like we were saying, Jesus wasn't looking for fame or to start a revolution. He wanted people to understand him through what he did, through his compassion, through challenging the norms, and ultimately through his sacrifice. Getting people excited too early wouldn't have helped with that.
Right, he was building towards something much bigger than just showing off his power.
Exactly. And Mark keeps highlighting this tension between Jesus' power and the need for people to really get what he was about. Like, think about the stories where he calms the storm and walks on water.
Those are always so powerful. You see that control over nature. And it's just like, wow, is there anything he can't do?
It's hard not to be amazed by those miracles. But Mark isn't just trying to impress us. He's connecting those events to our own lives. If Jesus can calm a real storm just by speaking, imagine what he can do for the storms we face in our own lives.
I see what you mean. All those anxieties, doubts, uncertainties we all go through. Maybe those are the storms Jesus wants to calm for us.
That's it. Mark is offering us this comfort. He's saying that even when life feels totally out of control, there's a power greater than us that can bring peace.
But not everyone liked seeing Jesus' power, did they? We see this growing opposition to him, especially from the Pharisees and the experts in the law. It's like they felt threatened by his popularity and how he challenged their authority.
Yeah, that's a major theme throughout Mark. It's not just about miracles and teachings. It's about two completely different ways of looking at the world. The religious leaders, with all their strict rules, represent a system that Jesus is actively trying to change.
You can really feel that tension building as the story unfolds. And it's not just the religious leaders. Even the disciples struggle to grasp what Jesus is really about.
What's so interesting about how Mark portrays the disciples is how human they are. They're not these perfect followers. They ask questions, they misinterpret things, they even argue with each other. They're so relatable.
Totally. Like when Jesus tells them for the third time that he's going to suffer and die, and they're still arguing about who's the greatest. It's like, come on, guys, how do you still not get it?
Well, you have to remember, the idea of a Messiah who suffers went against everything they believed. They were expecting a powerful leader who would overthrow Rome and set up an earthly kingdom.
So Jesus was basically turning their whole understanding of the Messiah upside down.
Exactly. He was challenging them, and us too, to rethink what real power and leadership look like. It's not about being in charge or achieving worldly success. It's about humility, about serving others, about sacrificing yourself for something bigger.
That's such a powerful message, especially in today's world. We're often taught the opposite. But Mark doesn't just leave us with these abstract ideas. He gives us actual examples of what this different kind of kingdom looks like.
Absolutely. Like the story of Jesus calling Levi, the tax collector, to follow him. This totally scandalized the Pharisees. Tax collectors were seen as collaborators with Rome, basically traitors.
So Jesus was reaching out to someone who was considered a sinner, an outcast.
Exactly. This scene perfectly captures how radically inclusive Jesus' ministry was. He wasn't bound by social norms or religious hierarchies. He was seeking out the marginalized, the forgotten, those who didn't fit in.
That's such a challenging but also hopeful message. It means that God's grace and love are for everyone, no matter what.
Absolutely. That's a central theme that runs through all of Mark's gospel. Whether it's the Syrophoenician woman begging for her daughter's healing, or the Roman centurion whose faith amazes Jesus, we see this consistent emphasis on God's compassion and his willingness to reach beyond traditional boundaries.
It's like Mark is saying, don't underestimate the power of faith, no matter where it comes from.
Exactly. And as we move towards the end of Mark's gospel, we'll see this tension between Jesus' power and his call to follow him play out in even more dramatic ways.
Okay, so we're back, and we're getting into the final part of Mark's gospel. Things are definitely about to get serious.
Yeah, there's a real shift in the story as we head towards Jerusalem. Jesus keeps talking about his suffering and death. But the disciples just don't seem to get it.
It's like they're in denial,
Mm-hmm.
still holding on to this idea of a conquering king, even though Jesus is telling them things are going to get rough.
Exactly. And then we get to that triumphal entry into Jerusalem, crowds cheering, Hosanna, palm branches everywhere. It's like they're treating him like a king.
But then he goes and flips over those tables in the temple. It's kind of a shock after all that celebration.
That scene is so important. It shows us that Jesus isn't just about miracles and nice teachings. He's willing to confront injustice, even within the religious system. It reminds us that faith isn't passive. It's about taking action against what's wrong.
It makes you think about what we need to change in our own lives, doesn't it? What are the things that need to be flipped over? The injustices we need to stand up against.
That's a good point. It gets to the core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It's not just about believing, it's about living it out, even when it's hard.
And then we get to the Last Supper, knowing what's going to happen next. It's just so powerful.
It's a huge turning point. Jesus is taking the Passover and making it new. The bread and wine, they represent his body and blood given for us. It's about love and sacrifice.
And then the Garden of Gethsemane. The way Mark describes Jesus' anguish, his prayer, you can really feel the weight he's carrying.
It's such a raw human moment. We see that Jesus is fully God and fully human. He's facing this terrible thing and he's struggling. It's a reminder that even in our darkest times, God understands our pain.
And then Judas betrays Jesus, a kiss. It's such a powerful image of how even those closest to us can hurt us.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. But it also starts the chain of events that leads to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion.
And the way Mark describes the crucifixion, it's so simple, but so powerful. He doesn't shy away from how brutal it was, but he focuses on the emotional impact.
The darkness, Jesus crying out to God, those images stick with you. They show us the depth of Jesus' suffering.
And then silence. It's over. It feels like despair. But Mark also hints that something new is coming.
And that something new is the resurrection. Mark doesn't actually describe it happening. He lets us imagine it. He focuses on the reactions of the people who find the empty tomb.
It's like he wants us to feel that shock, that disbelief, that joy. He's saying, figure this out for yourself. What does this empty tomb mean to you?
That's it. The resurrection isn't just a story. It's a reality that can change us. It gives us hope when we feel lost. It shows us that God is creating something new.
So as we finish up our deep dive into Mark, there's a lot to think about. We've seen Jesus challenged, his message of love clashing with the world, and his ultimate sacrifice on the cross. But it doesn't end there. The resurrection gives us hope. It reminds us that there's always new life.
Mark's gospel doesn't give us all the answers. It throws us right into the middle of Jesus' life and challenges us to figure out what it means for us.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, think about this. What are those tables you need to flip over in your own life? Where can you show Jesus' love and compassion? And how can the resurrection, this victory over death and promise of new life, change how you live?
Let Mark's gospel guide you. Let it challenge you. Let it give you hope.
Thanks for joining us on this journey through Mark. We hope you've been inspired to dig deeper, to ask questions, and to live out that message of love, hope, and change that's at the heart of this incredible book.